So these are the 7 most important chess tactics that you absolutely must know in order to get to that next level in chess. Today, we are going to have these 7 Grandmaster, World Champion, top tier chess players teach us these 7 tactics. Now, the first tactic we're going to explore here is called a fork. A fork is when you attack 2 pieces at the same time with a piece of lower value and you can only save 1. And in this situation, we'll be learning from Boris Spassky, a world champion, at the time considered to be one of the best chess players of all time before Bobby Fischer beat him. He still falls within my top 10. But in this situation, I want you to look at what is going on. The queen is eyeing down this dark square diagonal. We have a pin here as well, and the king is under duress. If we're not careful, queen to h8 could be a decisive victory. But here, Boris Spassky finds bishop takes rook, which is a no-brainer. You win the higher value piece, and you have to take back with the rook. This makes sense because you don't want to just give up the piece for free. And if the king does move over to f8, the queen gets h8. But now we find queen to h8. What is going on? Well, Boris Spassky is diverting the king. Notice the king actually is forced to take the queen because there's nowhere else for him to really go. But by doing that, you instigate the fork. Knight, check, king, but also the queen is in the crossfires. And no matter what you do, you're going to end up losing that queen. And this is just an amazing find by Boris Spassky, and it perfectly illustrates the value of the fork. Now we're going to explore stalemate tactics. And what exactly is a stalemate? A stalemate is when you cannot move your king, you cannot move any of your pieces, but you're also not in check, and it is your move, so the game ends in a draw. A stalemate trick or a tactic is when you can basically force your opponent, who is winning, to put you in a situation where you can't move and it's a draw. In this case, we're looking at a game by Daniil Dubov. He is a Rapids world champion, grandmaster, one of the top players to ever play. He's very, very good. And he finds the brilliant move, rook to f1. And the reason why this is brilliant is because he's inviting his opponent to play rook c7. This looks like a massive blunder. And of course, after we move over, we just lose the bishop. But here, Daniil Dubov has rook to f5, also a brilliant move. Now, what exactly is happening here? Well, you have to take the rook, because if you don't, and the king, let's say, moves over to g6, rook takes bishop here, and we're going to actually be able to stop this pawn from promoting, and we will most likely get that draw. However, if you take the rook, notice black has no more pieces other than the king. The king is blocking off e4 and e5. The bishop is blocking off d4 and d6. And the rook is covering the c file, meaning that this is actually a draw, stalemate, game over. That's it. Now we're going to look at an absolutely beautiful game by Daniel Naroditsky. Daniel Naroditsky is an age-level world champion, a grandmaster, and probably one of the most famous chess players to ever exist. And he's utilizing a tactic known as the pin. A pin is when you take a piece, like let's say this pawn here on g6, and by taking back, let's say this pawn h7, it would be illegal because the king would be discovered. Or maybe there's a piece here that you don't want to lose, and by taking back, you lose the game. So that's what a pin is. And in this situation, Naroditsky takes advantage of it with rook to g6. And this position is actually quite intricate. So for starters, we're attacking the queen, and the pawn cannot take back because it is pinned to the king, and we're also hanging our queen on h4. However, if you do take that queen on h4, we have 2 different ways to checkmate, and I'll show you both of them. So for starters, you can just play knight to f7. The king cannot move because of the rook blocking the g-file, and after rook takes, it's just checkmate. But there's actually an even nicer checkmate on the board. You can simply just play rook g8 first. The king cannot take this rook back, so the rook has to take, and then knight f7. Either way, it's really just your preference and choice as to how you win the game. So our opponent is not going to take the queen, instead taking back with the bishop. But now move order matters quite a lot here. If you were to take with the rook here, Yes, the pawn cannot take back, but the queen is still hanging. And now you do not have that same mating tactic because your rooks are not loaded up. So instead, knight takes, forking the king and the rook. If the queen takes back, the rook takes the queen, and the pin will stop you from losing your rook, and you'll just be up a queen-rook exchange. And of course, after the king just moves over, knight takes. This is also a check with the rook, meaning that we can't actually take the queen still. And after the king takes this knight, queen takes an f6, and you're going to get mated very, very shortly. Moving on to the next game, we have the Magician of Riga, Mikhail Tal. And Mikhail Tal is a world champion, considered the father of brilliant moves, one of the most entertaining chess players of all time, and he is going to illustrate to us how to use a Desperado tactic. A Desperado is when you have a trapped piece, and rather than losing that piece, you take another piece with you, such as a pawn or a smaller piece, in order to say, well, if I'm going to lose this piece, I'm taking you with me, and that's a Desperado. In this case, Tal plays knight to d4. Now, knight to d4 on its own isn't the craziest move in the world. If bishop takes back, and Tal likes his bishops over his knights, so he would be happy to have his dark square bishop on this really nice A to G diagonal. However, his opponent here is going to play knight to c6, saying, you can take my rook if you'd like, but I'm going to take your queen. But this is where the Desperado comes into effect. Tal finds the absolutely amazing knight takes f2, attacking the opponent's queen. Now, if we lose our queen, we take back. And if he tries to save this knight, let's say he goes to c6, we win another pawn, and now we're up 2 pawns, and c4 is going to be a nice safe square, and there's a profound advantage at the Grandmaster level. So you're not going to want to take the queen. Instead, you can take with the f2 king, right? But this is where Tal's brilliance really shines high, because queen to b6 is actually a fork, and we can win back that knight. In this particular game, Tal's opponent chooses not to take with the king. He doesn't want to expose his king to the dark square diagonal, and he plays queen to f3. But this position actually gets much worse because another Desperado, knight h3, pawn takes, and now queen to b6, once again winning the knight. Now, if you are enjoying this video, go ahead, subscribe, or just like the video. Let the algorithm know that this is where you want to learn chess. Moving on to the next tactic, we have a Greek gift sacrifice, and this will be explained by Bobby Fischer, a world champion, in my opinion, the best chess player of all time. Other than maybe Magnus Carlsen. You can let me know in the comments section if you disagree with this sentiment. But in this case, after the knight moves away back to e8, we can play bishop f7, and this is a Greek gift sacrifice. The reason why it's a Greek gift sacrifice is because you're sacrificing your bishop and asking your opponent to take back with his king and discombobulate your king's safety. Now, it's a little bit different here because the rook and the king can take, but I'm going to show you that no matter which piece you take with, you're still losing. So, for example, if the rook takes here, so rook f7, we have knight e6. And you quickly notice that the queen has no escape squares here. And in fact, if the pawn takes the knight, queen takes queen, and we've just sacrificed a bishop and a knight for a queen, and you can see that we're completely winning this game. We're also forking the 2 knights for good measure. So you actually can't take with the rook. So, okay, you can take with the king, right? Well, not so fast. This was also calculated by Bobby Fischer. We have knight to e6. And here is the same exact problem. The queen has nowhere to go, and taking the knight loses the queen. Now, you do have an extra option here. You could play king to e6, but this actually leads to a mating net. Queen d5. Notice the king cannot go back to safety and is forced to f5, and within the next couple of moves, the king will be forced over to h4, h5, and be quickly checkmated. It will be game over. Next up, we have Magnus Carlsen. He's going to show us how to trap opponents' pieces. Magnus Carlsen is probably the best chess player of all time, other than Bobby Fischer, but He is an absolute genius. Not only is he a master at trapping his opponent's pieces, but he makes up openings and beats five-time world champions, such as in this case, Vichy Anu. In this case, Magnus Carlsen invents the prisoner's gambit. And it starts off after knight f3, d5, and then b3, preparing the bishop's kettle. However, instead of kettling, he plays e4. The no-brainer response is to take back, forcing the knight to e5, and then playing this insane fork. Now, you can look at this position for an hour, and I've tried it, and you can say, what do you do here? Well, Magnus Carlsen says, I'm going to play bishop b2 because it defends the rook and the knight. But this doesn't make any sense because you're hanging the bishop, right? So look, you're hanging the bishop. But here, Magnus Carlsen has calculated that actually you cannot save your queen. After knight to c3, this queen is completely trapped. Queen to a3 is the proactive move to prevent this trap. But here we have bishop b5. The bishop comes to block, and then we play knight to c4, forcing the queen over to b4. And notice that there's just nowhere else for the queen to really go, right? All these other squares are blocked. So yeah, the queen has to go to b4. Bishop takes, knight takes back, and the final nail in the coffin, a3. And while it doesn't look like it at first, the queen has nowhere to go. So obviously taking any of these pieces will lead to a pawn or rook, knight, whatever it is, taking the queen back. But the knights are perfectly stealing all of the queen's space, and he is completely trapped. Best move here, queen takes knight, pawn takes back, and look at this massive advantage for Magnus Carlsen. And this is actually called the prisoner's gambit. The final tactic that we're going to look at today, and probably the most brilliant one of all, the double check. And this is shown perfectly by Edward Lasker, a third cousin of world champion Emanuel Lasker. But don't feel let down. This is one of the most famous games of all time. It is called the Immortal King Walk. In this situation, Lasker plays queen to h7 and is forced. You have to take back. And by doing so, it instigates this insane double check. Knight is checking the king, but also the bishop is checking the king. Now, a double check is when you are checking your opponent with two different pieces. And the rules are simple. If this is happening, the king must move, and you cannot take either piece unless it is with the king. In this case, our opponent only has h8 and h6, and this is the last choice that he will make. As if he plays king to h8, it is checkmate on the spot. You have this beautiful and elegant mating pattern. You would have loved to get rid of this f6 knight, but you couldn't do it because the bishop was also checking the king. So, okay, we know that is losing. So h6 is really the only option, but it's not much better because starters, knight to g4. Notice here that you are forcing your opponent to play g5, so that is a forced move. In this situation, just h4. Once again, f4, a forced move. There was nowhere else to go. And then you have check on g3. Slowly but surely, the king is getting closer and closer to his tomb, and he is running out of squares, forced to play f3. So we go ahead and play bishop to e2. King moves over to g2, and then rook h2, forcing the king to the first rank, where we hit him with the vicious long castle. Notice the knight is defending the rook, which covers the second rank, and then our rook on d1 is now covering the first rank. It's actually a ladder mate long castle by Emanuel Lasker. And listen, I get it. While these tactics are extremely important, we went into the highest possible grandmaster level of these tactics. If you wanted to dive into these very important tactics, but at a lower beginner, intermediate, and then expert level, you can do that right here with our 7 tactics video. This goes a lot deeper into the subject. But other than that, stay classy, my friends. Until next time.